So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Modern Europe Colloquium. I am Lauren Crawford, one of the Colloquium's co-chairs, along with Sophia de Leonibus and Kostas Zivas. And we are delighted to welcome you to our second event of the semester, which is also the first in-person colloquium since the pandemic started. So I think you can all appreciate just how excited we are for today's event. And it's our great pleasure today to join Dr. Terence Renaud and Professor Samuel Moyn for a discussion on Dr. Renaud's newly published book, New Lefts, The Making of a Radical Tradition. But before I introduce Dr. Renaud and Professor Moyn, I want to briefly mention some housekeeping notes that will help the event flow smoothly, especially as we have both a virtual and in-person audience. Following Dr. Renaud's introduction to his work and Professor Moyn's commentary, we will open the floor to a Q&A session. During our Q&A, we ask that those who are in person raise their hands to notify us that they would like to ask a question. For those attending virtually, we ask that you submit your question via the Q&A function on the webinar. Sophia will then share your question with everyone over the course of the discussion. So on to our introduction. Dr. Terry Renaud is currently a lecturer in the Department of History and the Humanities program at Yale. Dr. Renaud joined Yale after receiving a PhD in history with an emphasis in critical theory from UC Berkeley in 2015. He is a historian of modern Europe who specializes in German intellectual history, radical democracy, and transnational social movements. His first book, New Lefts, The Making of a Radical Tradition, which appeared in September with Princeton University Press, traces the history of a phenomenon he calls neoleftism, by telling the story of 3 generations of anti-fascists, left socialists, and anti-authoritarians who tried to build radical democratic alternatives to capitalism and kindle hope in reactionary times. Dr. Renaud has published widely with articles in German history, New German Critique, the Historical Journal, and Modern Intellectual History, along with essays and publications such as Foreign Policy and the Los Angeles Review of Books, to name just a few. He has received invitations to present his work in an array of venues, including Queen Mary University of London, NYU, UC Berkeley, and Humboldt University in Berlin. His scholarship has won him a robust collection of fellowships, grants, and other awards, including a postdoctoral fellowship from the Volkswagen and Andrew W. Mellon Foundations, a research grant from the Central European History Society, a Whitney Humanities Center Fellowship from Yale, and a German Chancellor Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. In addition to his work at Yale, Dr. Renaud has held positions as a visiting researcher both at Humboldt University as well as at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, Germany. And lastly, Dr. Renaud is currently working on a new book project concerning visual representations of capitalism around the turn of the 20th century. Professor Moyn has generously agreed to offer some reflections on Dr. Renaud's chapters. Samuel Moyn is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History here in Yale's History Department. Professor Moyn received his doctorate in Modern European History from UC Berkeley in 2000 and a law degree from Harvard University in 2001. His areas of interest in legal scholarship include international law, human rights, the law of war, and legal thought. In intellectual history, he has worked on a diverse range of subjects, especially 20th century European moral and political theory. Professor Moyn has written several books on European intellectual history and the history of human rights, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, and Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. He has just recently published Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, out just last month with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. And on that note, I will turn the stage over to Dr. Renaud, who will offer a brief introduction to New Lefts, followed by commentary from Professor Moyn. Dr. Renaud will have a chance to respond, and then we will open the floor up to our Q&A session. So do feel free to send questions via the Q&A to Sophia during the talk if you are tuning in on Zoom. Yeah, thank you.
Well, first I'd like to thank Lauren and Sophia for the invitation, and I'd like to thank the rest of the team, Christina, Kostas, for helping organize this event. I learned that Anna Dunsing designed that cool poster, so I need to give a shout out to her. And of course, thank Professor Moyn for agreeing to comment. Since many of you will have read the book's introduction, which was pre-circulated along with chapter 7. I won't summarize the book directly. Instead, I thought it might be useful, especially for the grad students in attendance, to say a few words about how the dissertation turned into the book. So as Lauren noted, I finished my PhD at UC Berkeley in 2015. And the dissertation that resulted was called Restarting Socialism, the Neu Beginnen Group, and the Problem of Renewal on the German Left, 1930 to 1970. And I had to look up that title because I've forgotten it. As the title suggests, the focus of the dissertation was this group called Neu Beginnen, or Neu Beginnen in German. It was in English, it was called the Neu Beginnen Group, which formed in Berlin around 1930, so a couple of years before the collapse of the Weimar Republic. It was a small group of renegade communists and dissident left-wing social democrats and sort of non-aligned leftists who lamented the tragic division on the German left between social democrats and communists, lamented what seemed to be the sort of prostrate or soon to be defeated organized labor movement, and disagreed with interpretations of the rising fascist movement that were then prevalent in left-wing circles. So they thought that by using conspiratorial means, they might infiltrate the major parties and other organizations of the left, the German left at the time, and kind of surreptitiously steer their policies toward a unity program. It was never exactly clear the mechanism of this strategy, but it was clear that it would be a long-term process. So in January 1933, the priorities of the Neu Beginnen Group abruptly shifted to underground anti-fascist resistance. And the primary activity that these clandestine members of this group, who never numbered more than several hundred people in the core and maybe several thousand people in the periphery or the penumbra of sympathizers, their primary activity was to collect intelligence about every aspect of Nazi German society and economy and social life, and compile that data into reports that would be published abroad, not only in German, but in English and French translations, all with the purpose of rallying a kind of united anti-fascist front. So the focus of the dissertation was very empirical. It was collecting as much information as I could about the members of the group, identifying who in fact was a member of the group. I have several very elaborate Excel sheets with the many, many pseudonyms and aliases that these people used, trying to kind of attach names to actual people. I consulted the archive that has been put together for the group itself, which is located at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, but that's a limited collection. Most of the information I had to sort of piece together from Gestapo files and memoirs and personal papers of the former members, correspondence of various kinds. And there had been some work in German on this group and on the many other kind of small socialist splinter groups that proliferated in the 1930s. But I thought the new perspective that I could bring to the project would involve conducting more of a collective biography of the members of the group, and especially tracking their careers after World War II, after the official dissolution of the Neu Beginnen Group, just to see if I could discern any kind of ideological or practical effect that the group had in particularly West Germany and the reformulations of socialism that occurred in the late 1940s, 1950s. And I was especially attentive to this major caesura in the history of the Social Democratic Party in 1959, at the Bad Godesberg Convention, when the party officially abandons Marxism, kind of deletes Marxist phraseology and theory from its party program, shifts this attention away from the working class, its historic base, and toward kind of a popular middle class as its base. The Godesberg Convention and its new party program that was agreed upon there provided the basis in the subsequent few years for purging leftists of many kinds from the party ranks. Most importantly, the socialist university students in the SDS. And that core of students who were essentially, their membership in SDS was ruled irreconcilable with the party membership. This would become the core of the West German New Left in the mid to late 1960s. So the dissertation was very much focused on Germany, on the, it was very empirical, it was very, very careful in its claims, almost too careful in its claims. The project became very boring to me by the time I was done, an experience I think many of us might share who are maybe if you're nearing the end of your dissertation. So I had the good fortune to have a postdoctoral fellowship here at Yale, gave me some time and support to rewrite the dissertation once I was ready to return to it. I needed to make it interesting for myself again. So on the recommendation of some of the dissertation advisors, as well as some other readers of the dissertation, I expanded my focus beyond Germany. I wanted to see if I could find comparative cases in other Western European countries of analogous socialist small groups or anti-fascist organizations that position themselves in between the fronts of social democracy and communism and tried to articulate some kind of revolutionary socialist alternative. So I did find some comparative cases, mainly in France, in Spain during the Civil War, and in Britain. In addition to kind of broadening the geographical focus, I thought that the argument of the book needed to be refined, and there were some conceptual claims I wanted to make of a bolder sort than were made in the dissertation. So the framing device of the dissertation was socialist renewal, the discourse of renewal, what that meant in terms of renewing personnel, but also modernizing the ideas that were meant to guide socialist strategy in Germany, especially during the fascist crisis and post-fascist reconstruction. I shifted away from that toward a new conceptual paradigm of neoleftism, or new lefts, plural. And the reason I kind of did this was my own frustration at these traditional ideological labels that one has to grapple with whenever studying the history of the left, but also when studying any kind of modern political ideology. There's socialism, social democracy, communism, liberalism, conservatism, the array of standard labels that were certainly self-applied by a lot of these historical subjects, but labels that we continue to apply as heuristic devices. I found that first, by focusing on socialist renewal or socialism, there was a tendency in my dissertation toward a kind of idealist argument. I was tracing the evolution of socialism and its changing meanings, but I didn't have an adequate way of linking that conceptual history to the concrete history of socialist organizations and the practical politics that they were undertaking through various generations over the course of the middle of the 20th century. So I thought, well, can I come up with some concept to more specifically describe the organizational phenomena that I'm seeing over these few decades? And that organizational phenomenon seemed to be successive breaks from the existing forms of left organization at the time. And the primary political form was the party form, and there are, of course, several different forms of the party. A democratic mass party, which is the archetype of SPD, I guess. And then sort of a centralized vanguardist party might be the archetype of a communist party. This varies a lot from country to country as well, and changes over time. And then the labor form of organizing would be the union form or the syndicate. So what I was seeing was a proliferation of non-party groups or non-union groups that explicitly did not want to organize themselves like a party. They wanted to organize themselves like something else. And they had various terms for this and various different organizational structures. Action committees, networks, decentralized federations of various kinds. The commune concept was still alive in some circles. There was a revival of the Soviet or council concept. These were a variety of non-hierarchical forms, which posed a challenge of internal party democracy, or I should be careful about the party term, internal democracy, that I saw as sort of the constitutive feature of the various small groups that I was analyzing in the German context, Spanish context, and French context. So this formal process, I began to think of as a proliferation of new lefts, in distinction to the forms of the old left. This led me, in the course of revising the book, to conceive of what before had appeared to me as the fragmentation and division of the left, especially during the fascist crisis, but also looking ahead in the 1960s, the proliferation of various anti-authoritarian organizations and sectarian groups under the general aegis of the New Left or not. Instead of a negative phenomenon or sort of a tragic, sort of divisive phenomenon, I began to view this as successive moments of organizational experimentation and proof of creativity and the vitality of the left in response to crisis or defeat. So I sort of tried to adopt an analytic of optimism, I guess, to see what type of new forms were made possible in these moments. I also became attentive to the dilemma or paradox that was present in all of these new left formations, starting with the Neu Beginnen group, but continuing on through left socialists formations in the post-war years, and probably the apotheosis of this were the many small groups that popped up like mushrooms around the events of 1968 in Western Europe. And that was the inability to sustain internal democracy over any long period of time, or the inability to sustain the organization at all over any long period of time. So almost as a law, and I am thinking of Robert Mikel's iron law of oligarchy a little bit here, the elite theorists or sociologist of organization. Almost by law, there are kind of three possibilities for these small groups as they popped up. The first is that they would just kind of dissolve due to internal strife and external pressure. And that external pressure during the fascist crisis could be direct police repression. A second possibility was assimilation or institutionalization. And actually, I saw this possibility as the predominant, afterlife of the Neu Beginnen group. A lot of its former members went on to positions of leadership within the Social Democratic Party in West Germany, and tried to institutionalize in one form or another the ideas that had once been radical. And then the third possibility is sort of an authoritarian hardening of the small group, which had professed to be egalitarian or democratic at its instantiation. So that would be the Mikel's option, the oligarchical degeneration. In the late 1960s, you can kind of see this degeneration from the more spontaneous extra-parliamentary opposition of the 1965 through 1968, a transition from that into the kind of much more sectarian K groups and Maoist cells that formed in late 60s and early 1970s. So I thought that this concept of neoleftism, which I was starting to conceive of as sort of a succession, a historical succession or dialectical succession of new lefts, was a more adequate way of interpreting three moments in mid-20th century history of the left in Western Europe. And I identify those moments as radical anti-fascism in the 1920s and 30s, left socialism in the 1940s and 50s, and you read about that perhaps in the chapter 7 that was circulated, and then anti-authoritarianism in the 1960s. And this book was, I think, one of the, in my kind of survey of the field, one of the first attempts to synthesize these three moments into a general history, which is still very German in its focus, but is populated with comparative cases. So the last thing I'll say, I just have a couple paragraphs here from the epilogue of my book that sort of tie this all together. So I'll read from that. Historians of anti-fascism tend to look backward to the revolutionary crisis of 1918 to 1919 and earlier in order to explain the fratricidal conflict between social democrats, communists, anarchists, and other lefts. And the underlying claim of this body of scholarship is usually that division on the left enabled fascists to seize power, a claim that my book doesn't necessarily dispute. Meanwhile, historians of the 60s tend to look forward to ways in which the anti-authoritarian revolt of that decade anticipated the new social movements of the 1970s through the present day. And that's another claim or direction that my book does not really dispute. Instead, though, I decided to turn the gazes of both bodies of scholarship toward each other, inward. Anti-fascism looking forward and anti-authoritarianism looking backward. And this intro version, to my mind, brought the phenomenon of neo-leftism, or new lefts, into focus. And left socialism sits at the center of that field of vision. Only in the 1950s did militants in Western Europe start giving a proper name to this marginal phenomenon, that is the new left. The new left of the 1950s and 60s formalized a long-term process and radical tradition of breaking free from social democratic and communist institutions. The various neo-leftists examined in the book, from members of the Neu Beginnen group in Germany to the French May movement of 1968, failed to solve the dilemma of sustaining internal democracy. Recognizing failure was a symbolic act of maturity for many radicals who later gave up on new lefts. Some exited politics altogether, but most ex-neo-leftists grew up by accommodating themselves to pragmatic reforms within the framework of democratic capitalism. Thus, representatives of a formerly neo-leftist generation often found themselves targeted by a rising new left, which again demanded total transformation and a radical break from existing society. So this book's main trope, as Hayden White might interpret it, is irony. New lefts were constantly evolving into old lefts, and the cornerstones of one generation turned into stumbling blocks for the next. In White's terms, this book's motive and plotment is tragicomedy. Tragic because mid-century neo-leftists believed that they were acting in freedom, but their actions were in fact caught within some kind of cycle of renewal obsolescence from which it seemed impossible to escape. And comic because occasionally they did enjoy temporary success and, as White puts it, reconciliation of their desires with the opposing forces of the world. This book does not impose a contrived narrative on its subjects, however, because many neo-leftists themselves showed an awareness, an ironic awareness of this tragicomic emplotment. That awareness influenced their decisions and response to the neo-leftist dilemma. In addition to its historical argument, this book defines neoleftism as a political phenomenon whose relevance extends beyond the mid-20th century. Much as one can write the history of liberalism or conservatism in a way that includes people or movements that did not always call themselves liberal or conservative, I frame this book as an attempt to rethink neoleftism as a theory and practice that transcended the actual use of the term New Left. Neoleftism does differ from other ideologies, such as liberalism or conservatism, in its determination by organizational form. As I've suggested, neoleftism or new lefts involve a total commitment to synchronize revolutionary means and ends. On the broad historical spectrum of the left, new lefts represent the most radically prefigurative position. The desired future society must be modeled now in the presently existing movement. That's the ethical commitment behind this. And rather more than social democrats or communists or anarchists, neo-leftists worried about the paradox of their own enterprise, the inability to sustain new forms, the ephemerality of grassroots action, the challenge of internal democracy. This book describes the dilemma faced by neo-leftists in several ways. Once radical forms can and do change into routinized forms. And neo-leftists' resistance to routinization often translated into this self-conscious attitude of nonconformism or rebellion. Because it unfolds over time as militants realize the limits of their own organizational form, neo-leftism must be understood as a process, a succession of new lefts, one after the other, rather than a stable political ideology. So this book opposes any definition of the new left that's derived from the characteristics of just one historical moment in that succession, such as the 1960s. It's my hope that the book will make historical new lefts recognizable as a radical tradition and perhaps even as an ongoing tradition. So I look forward to hearing Sam's commentary and answering questions from the audience. I actually had two questions for myself, I guess, that remain after finishing the book. And so I thought that I would pose them here just to have them on the table for people to consider. The first question I have for myself, does neo-leftism apply generally beyond Germany and Western Europe? And specifically, does the US New Left fit into the paradigm? I talked briefly about the US case in the book, but I provided some reasons for why I don't think that it fits, but I'm very cautious about those claims. The second question, what distinguishes new lefts from new rights, both historically and conceptually in terms of their modes of organization? Both seem to espouse a certain nonconformism or rebellion, both claim to break away from old forms of the left and the right, respectively. Is there any way to distinguish them besides simply observing that one's on the left and one's on the right? So those are the two questions I had for myself. Thanks.
Okay, well, this is an enormous privilege to get to sit up here with Terry, and I'll try to be brief and informal, partly because I want to, hear Terry answer his own questions and engage with yours and those that come from online. But also, because no one said this, but I think this is really a celebratory event. As it turns out, Terry and I are the only ones with any beverage, and it's not alcoholic. But I hope that even though it's great that we're returning to, real life interaction, we can imagine a time when, we can raise, our glasses to Terry, and we can figuratively do that throughout, because this is a superb book. I've seen parts of it in different forms and talked with Terry over the years, and I think the outcome is spectacular. And I don't have much else to say, but I'll make a couple of kind of more precise comments about two of its many points of distinction, and I'll ask two questions, spin them out a little bit. So first, I just wanted to mention the formal features, just the writing, and I want to get into what Terry, I think, properly raised, which is that this is not a dissertation, it's a revised book. And I think for anyone interested in how you move from dissertation to book, a really model revision. So if you read the book, and I know some of us have read just portions of it for this occasion, you'll find that it's beautifully clear and avoids the very common sin of being overwritten. He covers an enormous amount, and he does so in relatively spare prose that make it, I think, really accessible and allow him to cover a lot more than many authors ever could in a couple of hundred pages. And more than that, I think Terry has a gift for sometimes approaching even aphorism. You read one, if you looked at the intro, where he remarks that part of what's at stake in neoleftism is keeping politics forever young, which I thought was beautifully put, with the proviso, from Karl Mannheim, that we're not necessarily talking about biological youth. I also want to mention that the real achievement in the revision, I think, is a kind of perfect equipoise between the particular and the general. He clearly kept a lot of the particularity, including in the chapter we read, the two main kind of character studies. But what's amazing is how successfully throughout Terry is able to shuttle between those particular stories and the general, and not just in Germany, but to look at comparable cases in other West European countries. And I think that is a really rare achievement to figure out how much you stick with the particular, as I think Terry did much more in his dissertation, and how much you attempt to generalize your account without making it too general. So there's a lot more to praise, but I'm just going to mention those formal features and then ask my two questions. So first, you really got to this in your comments just now, but the kind of move that you're making is what you call at one point in the intro a temporal turn, and in what I basically want to ask about is how it is that you think about continuity and novelty, and especially rupture in the history of neo-leftism. Now, I'm not suggesting that you didn't get it right, because as you said in reading from your own epilogue, the greatest concern is not to overemphasize either. Nonetheless, there's a great emphasis on kind of embedding the 1960s in a longer story, without which it wouldn't have been possible, and especially to dwell on a series of different phenomena, actually, that I think you also enumerated. Maybe there's more than I'll enumerate now, but there are analogous situations which recur, and there are common theoretical problems, and that'll kind of later we'll get to a second question, which you also raise at the end, of kind of the organizational dilemma. And then above all, there are, especially in what we read, there are bridge figures. And so I just want to ask, how do we think about, especially the 60s new left coming at the end of the story, and indeed our own attempts later in history to possibly have a neo-leftism at a later date, and possibly in other places too than Western Europe. So what seems to be going on is all of those above features of recurrence, repetition with change, and above all, kind of individuals who, in a kind of cold climate, end up getting credited for some kind of continuity. Of course, for any novelty, there's always going to be continuity, the obscure figures who kept something alive. But we know, and you also emphasize elsewhere, that there are ways in which old traditions that have been completely lost have to be rediscovered, and that seems true even with respect to this period in the kind of theoretical materials, since notwithstanding the importance of Abendroth as as Habermas's, mentor at a certain point when he was writing the structural transformation, or the kind of sheer interest of Leftheim's theories. We've been raised on stories of how the New Left had to go down the basement and find these crated up issues of the Frankfurt School's journal, which, some of the Frankfurt School figures may not have wanted to circulate.
Right.
And, at other times when there's no rediscovery after a rupture, there's the kind of very familiar phenomenon of reinventing the wheel, which I think is such an endemic part of the history of the left, for good and for ill, and the right, I'm sure. But I wanted to ask, how did you think about kind of restoring the credentials of Neu Beginnen and the figures associated with it, while taking account of the serious ruptures that have to be kind of central to our understanding? And then there are just sheer novelties. So, apart from, rediscovery and kind of reinvention of the same without any exposure to what's come before, you emphasize that there are just new things that some versions of the New Left have to do that have never been done before. A lot of analogy, for example, when it comes to common emphasis in Weimar and after in the 60s on sexual liberation, but we have to work in novelty too in an effective and theorized way. At one point, Terry writes, and this is again a great aphorism: "Meet the old left once the same as the new left." But you kind of mean that you have to mean that in a restricted way. I mean, it makes sense of the fact that, there are these generational dynamics where some people who had been in the old new left end up joining the SPD and kind of becoming the foes of the new left. But what I think is worth asking about is, how do we then work in the things that aphorism doesn't describe? I'll just mention one that comes up in the readings, and it's not developed, but I think it's kind of an amazing thing that Terry says, which is that the new left in recent times has been a doppelganger of sorts of neoliberalism, and that just can't have been true of the old, anti-fascist formations of the Weimar period. And, Terry says something very interesting about that connection, and I think it's worth exploring. But it's an example in your own account, among many others, of novelty. Last on this first question, I'm curious about just methodologically of the place of intellectual history in the story in the end. Because you could have imagined a shift to this much broader topic that would decenter figures like Abendroth and Fleckheim, especially to the extent that, the coverage of them is less about like their place in networks intergenerationally and influence, but more about like what they said in their books and what their relation was. But you chose to retain the kind of intellectual history at multiple points in the book. And I'm for that, obviously. I just wanted to get maybe at whether that was a kind of artifact of the dissertation approach that you kind of chose to retain rather than drop. Okay, second question, very brief, is about what I saw as a major aspect of this book beyond the kind of study of continuity and rupture, which you only addressed at the tail end, which is the centrality of the organizational question. And this is fascinating because, of course, you could go back further before the 1920s and 30s. It seems like from the beginning of socialism and from the beginning of Marxism, with its rivalry and disputes with Mikhail Bakunin and Ferdinand Lassalle, it's not the same, but there's been a very difficult question about what kind of movement, what kind of institutional form do socialism and Marxism take? And I'd emphasize that, of course, in the period you're talking about, although maybe not in the pages we read, there's also a debate about whether to just kind of think about organizational alternatives within Marxism or like between Marxism and other theories. So I was struck at the very end of the chapter by this reference to Jean-Paul Sartre, who in the Critique of Practical Reason is remaining within Marxism, but attempting to reinvent it in light of a kind of neo-leftist imperative. But what's very revealing, if we know his history, is that he's brutally repressed those, notably in this debate with Claude Lefort in the early 50s, who actually don't think we should, throw in our lot with the bureaucratic party at all, and don't need the workers to answer to leaders. And of course, it's true that Sartre evolved in a certain way, but Lefort and other kind of libertarian sorts, took this debate about organizational form beyond the confines of Marxism, which doesn't happen exactly with Abendroth and Fleckheim. And I just wanted to mention it because my last aspect of this question is like, what does this debate tell us today? When some people want to build a newer left, we could talk about this country if you want, but you can also address it more abstractly. I mean, we have a Democratic Party that's way to the right of the SPD, even after Bob Godesberg. Yeah. And yet, some of us are really happy that, Bernie Sanders is working more within the party and working with the budget committee with his 60s legacy and so forth. But it seems like if I read this book correctly, your heart is really with those who criticize the compromises that such party takeover strategies involve. Yeah. And the importance of non-bureaucratic alternatives within Marxism or socialism or the left generally seems more appealing to you, or real critically important, not just for reconstructing in the past, but for reminding ourselves in the present that they matter. And so I guess the question in this vein is, what do we do with this book when we take seriously its emphasis, not just on the history of the New Left, but the centrality of the organizational dilemma in it?
Great. Thank you very much, Sam. There's a lot there to work with. So maybe I'll say a few things in response to those questions, but maybe not too much, so that we can have engagement from others. So what you refer to as the temporal turn, I was articulating in contrast to the spatial turn in histories of the global 60s over the last, 15 years or so, maybe 10, 15 years. Studies of the kind of transnational connections between activist groups, particularly studies of the New Left, their engagement with foreign students, their imitation of tactics and strategies that were practiced in the United States, their solidarity with anti-colonial struggles around the world. The concept of the global 60s also transcends the history of the left. It's applied more widely to, I guess, the culture and general sensibilities that were cultivated in Western Europe in that decade, or perhaps it, extended beyond Western Europe as well. So the temporal term, what do I mean by that? It sort of referred to the general move of, I guess, writing a prehistory of the New Left by conceiving of earlier historical moments that featured the same organizational phenomena of breaking free from established parties and other established organizational forms, seeking this non-bureaucratic alternative and ideologically aligning with neither the kind of I guess, the Stalinist-oriented East, nor the, the capitalist-oriented West, and seeking some third force or third way. It was even called the third way in some contexts, although that word's sort of been co-opted a bit. But I like the way that you highlighted the problem, which is a theoretical, methodological one of accounting for continuity and rupture. It's sort of an endemic historian's problem, but there is something almost contradictory about trying to write history of a radical tradition of novel experimentations. So how can you have a tradition of disruptive breaks with, a prior existing, theory? It may be like orthodox Marxism, or prior existing party forms, union forms. And that sort of is the gambit of the book. I was inspired by, but did not mention in the text, Cedric Robinson's great book on Black Marxism, which I think also has a subtitle, The Making of a Radical Tradition. The press liked that, so I'll sort of absolve myself of some responsibility. But it's a monumental work, Black Marxism. It's a little imbalanced, the book. The first several parts are, covering the history of the colonization of the New World, going back to the 15th century, and the various mechanisms of sort of racialized capitalism that developed in the New World, before finally, in the last part, getting to like the core intellectuals of the Black radical tradition who formalized this thing, were aware of it. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Richard Wright. There were several others that we looked at. And so I do think that radical traditions, even ones that are predicated on this disruptive break or novelty or rupture from existing, political forms in this case, they must be made. There is a process of a making of a tradition, sort of in the spirit of E.P. Thompson, I guess, a little bit too. Each successive generation that I chart, so the first generation is coming of age in the 1920s and 30s, and then the second generation is coming of age in the 1940s and 50s, and then the third in the 1960s. As you say, rediscovers texts and histories of prior moments of what I will call neo-leftist action. Each generation finds it necessary to work through past defeats. I mean, the left, as Enzo Traverso and others will remind us, is a melancholic, or operates in a melancholic mode, always sort of dwelling on past defeats and failures. And that's almost what gives it the critical impetus to begin with. And there's to some extent, a cumulative process, but also some caesuras of forgetting. And World War II was one of them in Germany. My fifth chapter recounts the history of a number of Neu Beginnen members who did not go into exile, like maybe half the organization did, but remained underground in Germany. Maybe were in concentration camps, or simply just keeping their heads down. And they just had no idea what was going on outside of Germany. They had no idea what the kind of geopolitical situation was in the rest of Europe. This is like especially, during the period of the occupation, the early occupation, 1945, 46, before the reintroduction of independent newspapers, or the, in occupied Germany, before even like free, uncensored communication was allowed between the occupation zones. Often these Neu Beginnen members would send letters to their comrades in New York, reconnecting with them after like 6 or 7 years of not speaking to them due to the conditions of war, and requesting that they send newspapers. I even had like an example of somebody writing from occupied Berlin to somebody in New York requesting copies of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung to be sent to them from New York, because it was easier to get it that way than directly from Frankfurt because of the intrazonal kind of limitation on mail. And so that's all to say that there were real practical ways in which knowledge was interrupted. Traditions were broken and had to be rediscovered and reconstructed, especially after the Second World War. The bridge figures that you mentioned often were, particularly these two figures that I talk about in Chapter 7, Wolfgang Abendroth, who was kind of a scholar of jurisprudence and what he called political sociology at the University of Marburg in the 1950s and 60s, and then Ossip Fleckheim, who had been an emigre in the United States, and he taught at a couple universities in the U.S., Clark College in Atlanta, Bates and Coley colleges in Maine. Even attended, his first time back to Germany was as an advisor in the Nuremberg trials, but eventually he re-emigrates back to West Berlin and becomes a professor of political science at the Free University. These were individuals who, in their own experience and memory, were in the position potentially to mentor a young generation, a new generation, and give them the opportunity to reconnect with the traditions of radical anti-fascism, which may not have been directly accessible in West Germany. And again, I don't want to belabor the point, but it was very hard to get texts in Marxist philosophy, or it was impossible to get your hands on texts by Georg Lukács or Karl Korsch, or even by Marx in the classic texts of Orthodox Marxism, because they simply were destroyed during the Nazi regime. So a lot of the sort of bibliographic work that some of these radical students needed to do in the 1960s was impressive. It involved going to I mentioned already that International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, and making copies of books, going to used bookstores in New York City and buying copies of this material, and then creating pirated gray edition works that could be circulated at German universities. This was sort of a, kind of a slow way of rebuilding a bibliography or reading list, a curriculum even for leftist intellectuals. So yeah, the book, I don't think really has a methodological theory of how one combines continuity and rupture. But I try to, I guess, answer the problem or answer the question practically by just looking at how, how did intergenerational transmission take place? Who was speaking to whom? What texts were available? Who joined similar organizations? What was the sort of institutional memory of these organizations, if there was one? What was forgotten? That's kind of how I approached the issue. You also asked about the New Left and neoliberalism, but maybe I'll leave that aside for now. Somebody else might have a response to this question. I know it's a popular position, or a position on the US left today, to rebuke the US New Left of the 1960s and 70s for somehow introducing libertarian attitudes or celebrating modes of individuated self-expression and freedom that very easily were integrated or consonant with the features of neoliberal capitalism as they developed in the 1970s onward. So despite their intentions, let's say, the US New Left might have contributed to this new consensus. But I'll just restate the problem and maybe allow others to answer that. About organization, so you're correct, Sam, to say that organizational debates go back to the very origins of socialism in Europe, and they perhaps were the main issue that led to the dissolution of the First International. this conflict between the Marxists, the Proudhonists, and the Bakunists about whether the international workers movement and its political arm. And so first of all, there is the issue of should the international workers movement organize politically, and the Proudhonists, who were sort of workplace anarcho-syndicalists, didn't necessarily think so, nor did the anarchists, who were invested in direct control over localities and regions. So one question was whether to organize parties, organize politically, and then if so, what kind of party do we need? And the Marxists were more instrumental in thinking about, well, insofar as systems of electoral democracy exist, and they actually were not very deep or widespread in the 1860s, let's say, it's beneficial to organize parties that may compete for seats in parliament and may pursue like legislative reforms alongside the class struggle, which would be carried out primarily, I guess, in the workplace or in civil society. So you're correct. But I chose to focus on sort of the post-World War I, post-Central European revolutions period, because I think the distinguishing reference point for 20th century New Lefts was this this civil war between socialists and communists, which was exacerbated over the course of the 20s. This sort of mortal betrayal that especially German communists felt vis-a-vis the Social Democrats for, recruiting the paramilitary Freikorps to murder Luxembourg and Liebknecht and the revolution in 1919, and any number of sins that one could point to. So that was sort of the framework, as I mentioned before, for seeking a third way, a revolutionary socialist third way. It was a way to achieve left unity. And for the most part, that was working class unity, but the class basis of neo-leftist projects shifts over the time period that I cover in the book, so that by the post-war decades, there's a more expansive concept of the proletariat, anyone working for a wage or salary. And then there's, in some, quarters, an abandonment of the proletariat in general. This desire for unity was coupled with this desire to break free and create new forms. We didn't talk about it. My first chapter is devoted to the figure of Georg Lukács, and this is the way that I link the kind of era of Central European revolutions to the fascist period. And the hallmark of his work in the early period, leading up to his great work, History and Class Consciousness, a foundational work of Western Marxism, was that he was able to critique and analyze aesthetic forms, cultural forms, right alongside political forms like the party or the state. There's almost a direct transposition, for example, of Lukács's critique of the novel form, the form of the literary form of the novel, a transposition of that into politics in his critique of the party form, both as like providing certain opportunities and limits to self-expression, literary expression on the one hand, or political expression and power on the other hand. Right. So this preoccupation with new forms was the sort of central thread here. There's much more to say about that. I think there is relevance to later periods. The boundary dates of the book are roughly 1918 and 1968. Those are not precise dates. Maybe the first date is a little harder because of the context of the end of the First World War. 1968 I chose really as a symbolic ending point, that year being a historic year of uprisings around the world, including in the United States, which doesn't feature so directly in my story. But it's worth asking how this story applies to later periods. And I'll just plant a seed here of an answer rather than elaborating on an answer. I think something fundamentally changed in the contexts, the political context and the social context for the emergence of new lefts, starting in the 1970s and onward. Socially, you start seeing a rapid decline in the density of union membership, so in the power of organized labor in Western Europe. You start seeing the decline in party membership. If you read a study like Peter Mayer's book, Ruling the Void, the hollowing out of Western democracy, it's an analysis of the decline in mass participation in party politics and the shift toward like technocratic party managers, electoral campaign strategy, and all kinds of participation organized around voting alone, rather than the diverse activities that were characteristic of kind of social democracy in its heyday, like the choirs, the sports clubs, the all-encompassing cradle-to-grave life world of the left. I think the world of the left, both politically and socially, in Western Europe begins to dissolve and almost disappears over the latter part of the 20th century, just generally within this context of neoliberal capitalism. And so I think it means something different already by the 1990s or first decade of the 21st century to organize a new left, when there is no organized old left really to reject or to organize against. But again, that's just a seed of an answer. People might have more to say on that. So that's all.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating talk, and thank you, Sim, for your wonderful comments. I think we have quite a few questions on the feed here, but I'll also open it up to the room maybe to begin, just because it isn't for so long. Would you like to take the first stab?
Yeah.
And then Miguel.
Thank you very much for the talk, and congratulations on your book out. It's deeply impressive and very intimidating that you were able to do so many different languages in the transition between these two things. I'm curious to maybe pick up a little bit of a thread that you just ended with, which is the end date for this, especially as you discuss, not only sort of the way that 1960s historians look to the sort of transnational, but also to, as you say, looking forward, sort of to these other new social movements. What was sort of interesting to not see talking about the 1970s is Mao. And you talk about the explosion of the K-Gruppen and these others, but I'm curious what that sort of transnational influence and West German Maoism in particular might have had to do with this story that you're telling. Similarly, you sort of hint at it very briefly, and I can't speak to the last chapter that you've written, in which you focus on Dutschke and Cohn-Bendit, sort of big figures of this 1968 movement in Western Europe. But Ulrike Meinhof shows up in the chapter that you give us, and you very pointedly talk about the 70s sort of devolving into violence and terrorism, as you call it. I'm curious, maybe provocatively, is the Red Army faction not anti-fascist? Where does the Maoism of the 1970s, especially in this West German tradition, fit in with the story that you're telling in sort of a longer durée of what we would consider the sort of global 1960s?
Can I ask a question? What was the Red Army faction, Maoist?
Yes.
They were?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. Well, I need to do more reading on that.
Maybe before you respond, can we also take Miguel's question, just so,
Oh, yeah.
just for timing?
Okay, so thank you very much. This was really wonderful. I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of the book. Thank you. I had a question that sort of goes in that line, and then another one really quickly. Had to do with the abandonment of, as you were talking right now at the end of the abandonment of, or the expansion of the category of proletariat. And this ties with your self-posed question in the beginning about this as a Western European phenomenon, and in what sense, and then the question sort of turns into why would it be a Western European phenomenon, and the questions of labor aristocracy, the bourgeoisification of Western Europe, and can this model be extended? Why hasn't it been extended? Why has it worked? Why has it not worked? And the questions of the the replication of movements from the third world in Europe sort of answer themselves, because there's lots of money, there's lots of colonial extraction going on. So these groups are somehow this is my question. I'm not stating, and I would like to hear your opinions. Are sort of trying to build an anti-authoritarian perspective precisely because the socialist aspect has been conveniently hidden. And I'm not sure what you think about that. I would very much like to hear it. And then the other one, which was, I loved reading the chapters you post. I was not expecting you to say that that your tone was ironic optimism. I got, you see the same problem repeating itself, same problem repeating itself. Whatever victories the new left has brought, they're completely gone. There's nothing left. It's a complete set of ruins. It sort of turns, I mean, the same thing, whatever we think of the Soviet Union, it's also gone. So we sort of see paths that have proven themselves dead ends. And maybe, I'm not sure that's the lesson I would take from the story you're trying to tell. And thank you very much once again. And yeah.
Thanks. So, right. Yeah, I don't examine the history of Maoism very much in the book. In the last chapter on the 60s New Left, I do talk about the attraction of guerrilla struggles in the third world for people like Duchka and the West German New Left. Even the, there's a kind of short genealogy of Duchka's phrase that he would develop in the 70s, the March to the Institutions, which he referred to initially as a long march. And he was reading Regis Debray's book. In fact, he'd written a forward to the German translation of Regis Debray's book about Che and the guerrilla movements in South America. So that's just, an alternative example, not a Maoist example, I guess, of these third world affinities. And in fact, this issue does kind of go hand in hand with the question of the expanding definition of the proletariat that I think was occurring in my history in the 1950s and 60s among European activists. I think there was a great disillusionment with, let's say, the West German working class in this during the period of the great economic boom in West Germany, or the 30 glorious years in France. This era of democratic capitalism, which certainly was not equally prosperous for everyone in these countries, but generally saw expanding economy and a growing middle class, and in an uneven way, and a sort of deactivation of labor militancy after the late 1940s, after a couple waves of radical strikes in the late 1940s. So particularly radical youth on university campuses became disillusioned with the, I guess, industrial working class of their home country. And an older left socialist like Wolfgang Abendroth, who appears in this chapter, would caution against resituating or rebasing a leftist politics on some other class, or abandoning the industrial working class, which in the German context also must be remembered, had been subject to fascist domination for 12 years. And Abendroth said that the task for the left should be to reawaken working class consciousness, in addition to considering that, maybe the way to do that is to pay more attention to white collar workers, salaried employees, a whole range of people who, strictly speaking, don't own the means of production or don't own stock, dividends, and help manage capital or something. But the more radical anti-authoritarians disagreed with this more fusionist position of integrating the working class into a new left, and instead thought that matters were rather hopeless for organizing a mass socialist movement in the metropoles, and that the new left in Western Europe needed to adopt a more global perspective and realize that the proletariat was not, in a global perspective, was not in Europe, but was in the colonial or former colonial periphery. And it's this move to, I guess, exit the national frame and, very much in dialogue with Lenin, go back and adopt this anti-imperialist framework. This is when you start having, extensive reading of Che Guevara and Mao, and that integration into the movement. I think the real attraction of Maoism certainly was the revolution of everyday life that was contained under the Cultural Revolution, and the sense that Mao had initiated this spontaneous youth revolt against the party bureaucrats. It's almost as if Mao had initiated his own new left in a way to, I know I'm not an expert in this literature. I know there's a lot of debate about whether it got out of hand, whether Mao had an ulterior motive all along, how much was it within his control, that type of thing. But to Western Europeans who eventually were attracted to this, a more Maoist mode of organizing, this, it seemed like this was the global communist pole that one ought to align oneself, certainly not the Soviet form of bureaucratic communism that was hegemonic within the Soviet bloc. So there's no, like I said, there's no good reason to end this story in 1968. In the epilogue, I do kind of bring the story up to date in very very high level way, and I think I'll just refer to other people's work. The best work on this that I know, Karen Hanschu's book on terrorism, democracy in West Germany, about the RAF, or Patricia Meltzer's book about women activists in the RAF. And Hanschu in particular charts the growing sort of divide between the, I guess, the more mainstream left and the terrorist cells, so that, I guess we don't need to call them terrorists if we really don't want to use the label, but, these cells that were engaged in violent direct action against property and then against persons. There had been excuses that one could offer for this type of activism up until a certain point. In Hanschu's argument, it's like the German autumn, when the mainstream left abandons the concept of counter-violence instead of, and totally rules out the possibility of this violent confrontation, and initiates what another historian, Holger Nering, calls the era of nonviolence as the hegemonic form of leftist militancy, or any kind of progressive politics. It has to be nonviolent, or it's sort of unacceptable, within the European context. Right. So maybe for now, I won't answer the question of whether these are all dead ends, and whether any achievements of the 60s New Left are still with us, because I suspect other people will have a question about that, and I can answer in that context.
We're going to turn to two questions now from the Q&A. First, from Joanne Meyerowitz, who says, "Congratulations on the book, Terry. You start your book with Marcuse and the 1960s New Left, which made me wonder about the longer history in which New Leftists associated sexual oppression with fascist politics. How does a history of sexuality fit into your history of New Left? Dan mentioned this briefly. Could you please elaborate?" I'll pile another one on there from Jonathan Cape. who says, thank you for your talk, Terry. I agree with your critique of Traverso's focus on the Frankfurt School's high theory, which emphasizes defeat. Yet it is because those conceptual labors were often not tied to specific movements that their emancipatory visions live on as political horizons that still captivate so many today. So he asked, does focusing on quote unquote insider intellectuals can make your book more a history of strategies rather than ideas? And how do you negotiate the classic dilemma of the social history of ideas?
Brief, just because I'm sure there are many more questions.
Yeah, certainly. So briefly, in response to Joanne, thanks for that question. The main section of the book in which I address questions of sexuality prior to the 1960s comes in the chapter on the anti-fascist New Left, and particularly the figure of Wilhelm Reich, who was not a member of the Neu Beginnen group, but one of his collaborators in the sex pole clinics, these sex clinics that he pioneered in Austria and Germany in the 1920s, or late 1920s, early 1930s, was Edith Jacobson, who was kind of the in-house psychoanalyst of the Neu Beginnen group. They had in-house psychoanalysts and in-house lawyers to deal with the various problems that might arise with running a conspiratorial organization. Psychological traumas and legal troubles. I go into some detail about Reich's theory of fascism, particularly his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. I kind of look at the role of psychoanalysis within this Neu Beginnen group, why it was thought to be necessary to analyze members. There were both like surveillance and internal security concerns, but also I think that this was sort of the beginning of ways in which New Lefts were considering what it would mean to not only like liberate the person, but change the fabric of everyday life, gender relations, overturn all those social and cultural components of the fascist consensus. And it was a feature of Wilhelm Reich's book, for example, that not only did he, parrot the communist definition of fascism, it's like this reactionary clique in service of finance capital, but said that other components of this mass phenomena of fascism include the church, the family, so that an interfamily dynamic, say like a lower middle class family, the father's concern about providing food and material security for his children could kind of be mapped on, projected onto like a geopolitical phenomenon of Lebensraum, like a state seeking to provide material resources. That's just one of the examples of the connections that Wilhelm Reich makes. And in the 1960s, Reich was one of the most popular authors that was rediscovered by the 60s New Left generation in pirated editions, but like the words of Wilhelm Reich were painted on the walls of the Sorbonne. In answer to, was it John who posed the second question? Yes, I do have an implicit critique of the Frankfurt School in this book, although of the various members of the Frankfurt School, as Joanne mentioned, Herbert Marcuse is the one who sort of consistently, sides with the various New Lefts that arise in the book, most notably the 60s New Left, whereas the other representatives of the school were more standoffish, Adorno and Horkheimer, namely, were outright opposed to, what they perceived as, in Habermas's term, left fascism. It's a term that Habermas quickly disowned and said, "I'm sorry for using it," after a book edited by Abendroth appeared called, I think, "The Left Answers Habermas," and demonstrates why he was wrong to use that phrase. I think, just to keep the answer short, my focus on insider intellectuals, these lesser known theorists who are more engaged in the work of party politics, more engaged in activism than in, let's say, abstract speculation. It does make this book, I think I was just assent to John's option and say it does make this book more of a history of strategy or theories about strategy, theories about organization, than it does, than it is a history of ideas. And in fact, methodologically, I don't think this is a history of ideas. Certainly not ideas considered an abstraction. I don't know, Sam, you have some thoughts on those?
No.
Questions.
I agree with the way you put it.
Let's see.
Thank you both, and congratulations. As you said in the introduction, and as the title of your book implies, this seems to be a story in part about newness, about renewal, rupture, but also one about age, and in particular, youth. So my question is really what kind of youth? Youthfulness and body is obviously a limited resource, whereas political youthfulness might not be. So how did the historical subjects in your book can understand the relationship between the two? Was biological age a political or ideological viability, or was youth defined more conceptually and more capaciously kind of de-linked from biology?
Maybe we'll say in the flowery mask and then in the black mask.
Thank you. This was super interesting. I'm very excited to read the whole book. My question is also a little bit about the continuity and rupture idea, and I was wondering how much are the old left moving as well, because so they're kind of reinventing, new lefts are reinventing themselves against something that's also a moving target. And I'm saying that because I worked on a project where we analyzed position and debates in parliaments in Germany, France, Switzerland, etc. Over 70 years, and they seem to be always kind of changing position, and it was kind of hard to track for that. So yeah.
Great questions. Do you want to do the third?
Yeah, maybe the third. And
It seems very out of place now, but you spoke a little bit at the beginning about the impetus for the book project as being derived from your dissertation project, but just very simply, and out of curiosity, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit as to your motivations or inspirations to do this topic in whether that was regional interest, political interest, conceptual interest.
Great. Well, quickly, I'll just do them in reverse order, these questions. My motivation for the project, I started grad school, I guess, in 2009, and I researched and wrote the dissertation in the wake of the 2008 crisis. And this is sort of relevant to John's question earlier. I was studying with Martin Jay at UC Berkeley, wanted to do a project on Western Marxism and the intellectual history of the left. But I thought that in the present conditions of like the 2010s, it was not so useful to write another book on Adorno or something of that sort. That's kind of a flippant way of putting it. So that's what prompted me to look at these lesser known intellectuals who are more engaged in the politics in the 1930s and onward. Personally, there isn't much. It was an intellectual affinity. I've been asked before if I'm a red diaper baby. Do I have family members who are involved in the old left in this country? And no, it's not true. I came from like a provincial middle class, very non-radical youth. So this book is the negation. Flower mask. Thanks for the question. Yes, the old left was constantly responding to reinventing itself in the face of these challenges from these upstart groups that would pop up on their margins and challenge their legitimacy, and sometimes draw, like in a practical sense, draw money and support away from the large organizations of the left. And I try to do justice to this type of phenomenon of an old left renewing itself in a chapter I have on social democratic modernization. where a couple of these former New Beginning members become, like Fritz Ehrler, Richard Lerbenthal are the figures that I examine in this chapter. They become leading members or theorists affiliated with the German Social Democratic Party and spearhead this 1959 program revision, which they didn't see as a retreat into some kind of reformist liberalism. They saw it as an adoption of the most modern, progressive ideas, campaign strategies, etc. So yeah, I try to do justice to this attempt to renew an old left. Ultimately, though, I don't think they face the same organizational dilemmas as the sectarian small groups did. And finally, youth. What kind of youth? Yeah, I have a brief section about the sociologist Karl Mannheim in the beginning of the book, his essay on the concept of generations, which I rather like because it's a sociological definition of a generation rather than a biologically determinist one of like regular rhythms in group reproduction. No, for Mannheim, a generation is conditioned through both a common historical experience and potentially common class background, or although people from multiple classes could adhere to a generation. And so the classic example would be like a front generation in World War I. There is an age component. Most of these people were young, but it's not exclusively like a teenage affair or something like that. It was the actual experience of the trenches in World War I that had this coherent quality. So that's the concept of generation that I try to use in the book. I also, just briefly, I spend quite some time talking about Lenin's pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, which also includes a sort of non-age determinist concept of youth. And this is Lenin's piece from 1920, in which he's sort of polemically criticizing these various like anarchist and workerist groups that reject hierarchy, that have a more federalist idea of organizing themselves in terms of federal autonomy. And Lenin portrays them as being naive, inexperienced, romantic revolutionaries, and one ought to let the Bolsheviks in the room do the organizing, essentially. And this pamphlet haunts each successive generation of new lefts, to the point where one of my protagonists in chapter 8, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, can write a book called Obsolete Communism, a Senile Disorder, in which he sees this sort of Bolshevik party discipline as a hallmark of an obsolete, according to him, obsolete old left politics. So it's another one of the things that ties the book together.
I think, unfortunately, we probably have to end it there, just because we're nearing 5:30, but there's clearly so much more to talk about here, and having read the book, I can't recommend it enough to all of those of you who have not had the chance yet. And so a big thank you to Terry and to Sam. The Macmillan Center, Christina and Asia have helped us put this event together, both virtually and in person, so thank you very much to them. And a quick plug for our next event in 2 weeks. Actually, it will be on Friday, not Thursday, the usual meeting time. It's very October heavy calendar, but on October 29th, we have Robin Mitchell coming to speak about her book, Venus Noir, and that will be at noon, so noon to 1:30 on Friday. We hope to see you there. Thank you.